I believe that games are one of the most ancient forms of human culture. They might even be the most ancient form of human culture. I think perhaps we were playing before we were verbal as a species. When we think about games that might involve thousands of players at once in a massively multiplayer online game, there are phenomena that can happen in these spaces that are quite new, quite distinctive, even though they're connected to these ancient forms. And when we think about this in terms of something like virtual reality, we can see just what an expansive, inclusive cultural form games has an opportunity to be. I was a huge fan of games all throughout my childhood, games of all kinds, but video games in particular. And while I was at university, my passion for video games was reignited after a couple of years away from them. I was very lucky to be able to get a job in England working for a video game developer, and I knew straight away that I'd found my dream career, and I didn't look back. When I was a child, I saw an episode of the British science fiction television show called Doctor Who, which, though I didn't understand it at the time, made an allusion to virtual reality when Doctor Who enters a memory bank of his people, the Time Lords, which, funnily enough, was called the Matrix. While I was in high school, I read William Gibson's science fiction classic, Neuromancer, and that expanded my mind around the possibilities of using technology to create simulated realities that we could enter. And then, just after I graduated from university, I read Howard Rheingold's classic book, Virtual Reality, which helped me to understand the ways in which virtual reality was beginning to materialize in the real world. I got very excited about VR then, and this was round about the time that I was entering the game industry, so my interests in video games and VR have always been thoroughly intertwined. The very first video game that I worked on that was released was a flight simulator. It was only the second ever real-time 3D game for the video game console, the Sega Genesis. And so my career feels fortunate because it has this deep connection to the world of real-time 3D, which of course is so important for virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. The second and third and fourth games that I worked on were 2D games. They were games that were flat. But very soon in my career, I got back to work on 3D. And so for me, there's always been a deep kind of craft-based connection between the world of video games and the opening up possibilities of the world of VR, as we had to work out how to arrange vertices to create good-looking 3D models that were artistic, even though we were working under tight constraints of processing power, having to work with texture maps, bump maps, parallax maps, having to think about camera fields of view and issues of perspective. All of these fundamental things, which are of course ancient parts of human creative practice, stretching certainly back to the Renaissance, but even further, are all very interesting to me. And I think that's why, as a video game designer, I do and always have felt very connected to the world of virtual reality. So when I joined the game industry, it wasn't quite clear to any of us exactly what it was that a game designer, like me, does. Game design in the early 90s was a very new field. Game programming, game artists, those had been around for a while as more easily defined roles. And games had usually been designed by their artists, by their programmers, maybe by the sound designers working on them. But quite early on, it was suggested to me by one of my mentors that one of the fundamental things that a game designer does is to be an advocate for the experience of the player of the game. And this spoke to me very loudly. This was something that I could understand, partly through my understanding of other kinds of design discipline, whether that's industrial design or maybe graphic design, typographic design, architecture, fashion design. All of these designers are thinking about the ways that their works will impact other human beings, the human beings that engage with their design. So this seemed like a very clear lens to me as a way for game designers to orient themselves to their teams, to their players, and to the world. And straight away, it gave me a clear through line for the way that I wanted to approach my work. But of course, there are very many different kinds of games. It's a mistake, I think, to think of game design as one monolithic discipline. Different kinds of game designers have different interests and different preoccupations, maybe because they might be catering to broadly different types of players. And as we begin to think about design for virtual reality, I think these issues are very important. I think for a while there, because of perhaps the superficial connections that we might establish between video game design and virtual reality design, we may have had a tendency to think that the kinds of design patterns that we would want to use for virtual reality would be a lot like the kinds of design patterns that we use when we're making a PC game or a video game for console. I think that we're starting to discover that that is maybe not the case, that virtual reality brings its own particular design considerations to the table, perhaps to do with the duration of the experience that is optimal for the player, or to do with the way that players move around inside the world of virtual reality. As with any technology, there are gating factors, of course. I didn't realize for a long time just how much the issue of simulator sickness would be an orienting principle for designers in VR. So many people suffer from simulator sickness, especially if the game is designed without due consideration for the difference between the way that our inner ear perceives the world and the way that our visual field perceives the world. This is becoming quite a well-known problem. So I think for most kinds of players, we simply can't move the player around freely inside of the world of virtual reality experience as we can inside of a video game. This creates a big constraint, and I think it's going to mean that many of the types of game that work well on screens just won't work, at least for many people in VR. But I've always said, and I love to say to my students here at USC, that actually constraints are a designer's best friend. Constraints draw our greatest creativity out of us. And I do believe that this specific constraint around keeping players comfortable as relates to the behavior of their inner ear and the relationship between that and their stomach will help draw out of us new kinds of interesting experience that will then materialize in the world of VR. I believe that games are one of the most ancient forms of human culture. They might even be the most ancient form of human culture. I think it's possible, especially when we look at the way that other animals play, that play as a cultural form might even predate spoken language. I think perhaps we were playing before we were verbal as a species. And of course, without spoken language, we may have codified our games in different ways. Instead of negotiating the rules of the game through language, we might have figured it out through gesture. And so there are interesting questions here for me. But needless to say, I think that games and play and our intelligence and the way that we perceive the world and act in the world are all very deeply entwined. When we think about modern games, whether that's board games or card games or video games, clearly something has cohered around these ancient patterns of our being in the world. It's cohered around being able to write down the rules of a game that might become very complicated. Or when we think about games that might involve thousands of players at once in a massively multiplayer online game, there are phenomena that can happen in these spaces that are quite new, quite distinctive, even though they're connected to these ancient forms. And regarding the issue of what games are in their essential character, whether they are to entertain us, whether they might communicate something to us, whether they can be used for teaching or training, whether games can be an art form, which is an interesting debate that has unfolded, especially over the course of the last 10 years as we thought about video games as art. I think these are all interesting questions. I certainly think that because of some of the specific ways that games seem to draw our participatory natures out of us, that they have some interesting opportunities around these subjects. I think human beings are naturally very curious. We want to investigate, not just by looking at things, but by picking things up and seeing what they can do, interacting with them. And that obviously creates good opportunities for teachers. I think, when I think about all of my favorite teachers in high school, they were people who really got the class involved, and often in a hands-on way in the learning. Certainly that's a style that suits me well. But as a game designer with a capital G and a capital D, I wouldn't ever want to limit games by turning them towards one use or another. And I don't really think that games are a medium. I'm cribbing from my friend, the NYU professor Frank Lantz, when I say that rather than being a medium, games are a cultural form. And maybe even before being a cultural form like the novel or ballet, they are kind of a space of communicative possibility that has some particular characteristics, but that can't be pinned down to any one particular form or style. I think the important thing about a game is that it's a system that a human being can understand, at least partially, and begin to take part in, leading the system towards one outcome or another. And when we think about this in terms of something like virtual reality, we can see just what an expansive, inclusive cultural form games has an opportunity to be. Games tell us something about the culture from which they emerge. They tell us a lot about the values of that culture. They tell us about the identity of that culture, or at least how the people in charge of making the games view the identity of that culture. We've had a lot of good discussions recently in the world of video games about identity, about representation of different people's identities in video games, about what we might call diversity. I think that for a long time, video games had a problem. They didn't represent everyone in our communities of play very well. They only showed a few people from those communities, maybe the people who were most common, which at times might have been white men or white boys. But now things are changing. I think it's a mistake, by the way, to think that our communities were ever only made up of one group in the way that I just suggested. I think that the communities of play around video games have always been very diverse. There's always been people from many different genders playing video games, people of many different ethnicities, people with many different sexual orientations. But now, finally, we're starting starting to see better representations of all of those players as characters in the game. And I think that this is leading to even better games. Games are a great way for us to discuss culture, to discuss our own experiences, and communicate those experiences to other people in a way that's participatory and interactive, so that, yeah, I can really have you explore my world in perhaps some new ways than you've been able to do so before. And yeah, I think this is leading to richer games, that are narratively richer, but also richer in terms of their game mechanics, opening up new areas of possibility. And I'm very happy and excited about that.
What kind of impact do you think today's games have in society?
Well, there's an open question about what the impact of this might be, whether it might promote understanding, and certainly that would be my hope, my goal. Growing up in the 1980s in England, certainly the impact of popular media was very great in terms of helping us to understand one another. And I'm particularly thinking in terms of women's rights and gay rights. But at the same time, I don't think it's cut and dried. For a while, over the last few years, people have been talking in a very idealistic way about the possibilities of virtual reality as an empathy machine. Many of my friends in the world of game design and interactive media design, and in particular I'm thinking of people like Anna Anthropy and Samantha Gorman, have been very critical of this idea that either video games or virtual reality could be a shortcut to empathy. Their criticism is that it's all too easy for someone who enjoys a lot of privilege to have an emotional experience of connection to some marginalized group of people, but then to go back to living a life where they do not actively work to empower that marginalized group. And otherwise, we might feel good for a little while, but then go back to lazy ways of being where we're not working towards genuine societal change that will make life better for everyone. And I'm very sensitive to that criticism. I think it's a very good, well-founded criticism. So I'm a little skeptical about easy shortcuts to empathy and better understanding. I am feeling very positive about all of these things, VR and video games, other kinds of immersive media or interactive media, as having possibility for building long-term permanent change for the better. I just don't think that there are any shortcuts. I think that just as novelists and painters may have been doing the work of illuminating the human condition for a long time, so we as people working in these emerging fields are going to have to do the same hard work and try to understand what the true impact of our creativity might be on the world.